In 1943, the punishment for hiding a Jew in Nazi-occupied Poland wasn't negotiable. It wasn't a fine, it wasn't imprisonment, it wasn't deportation to a labor camp. It was execution, immediate, public, often by hanging in the town square as a warning to others. Not just for you, for your entire family, sometimes for your neighbors. The Nazis wanted the message clear. Jewish life had no value, and neither did the life of anyone who tried to preserve it. And yet, across occupied Poland, thousands of women hid Jewish men anyway. They carved false walls in barns, they forged baptismal certificates, they shared food they didn't have. They lied to German soldiers at their doorsteps. They risked everything, their lives, their children's lives, their futures, for people the world had abandoned. Some of these women fell in love with the men they sheltered. Terror has a way of collapsing time. Marriages happened in hiding, quiet ceremonies with no witnesses, binding two people together in a pact that felt like the only act of hope left in the world. When the war ended, these couples survived. Against impossible odds, they lived. Years later, they arrived in Israel, the new Jewish state, the safe haven, the place where Jewish survival was supposed to mean something. The women expected gratitude, they expected belonging, they expected recognition for what they'd risked. Instead, they were called shiksas, Gentile intruders. Some were spat on in the street, others were labeled Russian prostitutes in Hebrew newspapers, women who had supposedly seduced vulnerable Jewish men for personal gain. They had saved lives. Now they were treated as a demographic threat. How does a rescuer become an outsider? How does a nation built by genocide survivors learn to fear the women who once stood between their husbands and death? This is the story of the heroines nobody wanted. The geography of terror. By 1942, Poland had become a machinery of murder operating at industrial scale. The country held the highest concentration of Jews in Europe, over 3 million people. It also became the location of the 6 Nazi death camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chełmno, and Majdanek. This wasn't coincidental. The Nazis chose Poland deliberately. It was centrally located, it had railroad infrastructure, and its Jewish population could be isolated, concentrated, and destroyed with methodical efficiency. For Polish Jews, there were few paths to survival. Some went into hiding, a tiny fraction escaped east into Soviet territory. Most were deported to ghettos and then to camps. For those who went into hiding, survival depended entirely on the willingness of non-Jews to risk everything, and the Nazis made that risk absolute. The death penalty for mercy. In October 1941, Hans Frank, the Nazi governor of occupied Poland, issued a decree that made Poland unique in occupied Europe. Anyone who helped a Jew in any way, providing food, shelter, transportation, false documents, would be executed immediately. No trial, no appeal, summary execution. This wasn't symbolic. The Nazis enforced it relentlessly. Entire families were murdered for hiding a single Jewish child. In the village of Chepalu, 30 Polish civilians were shot for helping Jews escape a labor camp. In Przemysl, a Polish family was burned alive in their home because they'd hidden a Jewish family in their basement. The punishment extended beyond the immediate household. Neighbors could be executed for failing to report suspicious activity. Whole villages could face collective punishment. The message was clear: Jewish life had negative value. Protecting Jews didn't just endanger you, it endangered everyone around you. Against this backdrop, choosing to hide someone was choosing potential death, and thousands of Polish women chose it anyway. The rescue networks. Some rescues were organized. WW2, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, operated as an underground network coordinating safe houses, forged documents, and financial support. Women played central roles in WW2 operations because they attracted less suspicion moving through occupied cities. But most rescues were individual acts of moral courage that happened quietly, without coordination or support. A farm woman sees a Jewish man fleeing into the forest. She brings him inside. She hides him in the hayloft. She tells no one, not even her children, because children can't keep secrets under interrogation. A Catholic school teacher forges a baptismal certificate for a Jewish girl, creating a Christian identity out of ink and paper and the willingness to lie convincingly when the Gestapo comes asking questions. A shopkeeper's wife hides a Jewish family in a crawl space beneath her kitchen floor. For 2 years they live in darkness. She lowers food to them at night. She empties their waste buckets. She lives every day knowing that a single neighbor's suspicion could end all their lives. These weren't trained resistance fighters. They were ordinary women who saw human beings in danger and decided that doing nothing was unacceptable. The labor of rescue fell disproportionately on women because the nature of the work was domestic and therefore less visible. Hiding people required managing food supplies, laundry, noise, illness, and the psychological strain of people confined to tiny spaces for months or years. It required the kind of patient, invisible work that women had always done, but now the stakes were absolute. How love happens in the dark. Proximity creates intimacy. Fear accelerates it. When you share a hidden room for months, when your survival depends on trusting someone completely, when the only human voices you hear are each other's, emotional bonds form whether you intend them or not. The Jewish men in hiding were young. Their families had been murdered. Their former lives had been erased. The women who hid them became their only connection to human warmth. And many of these women were young too. Their husbands or boyfriends were dead, conscripted or missing. The war had destroyed normal life, normal courtship, normal futures. In that context, relationships developed. Sometimes it started practically, a shared meal, a conversation in whispers after dark, the strange comfort of another person's presence when the world outside was hunting you. Sometimes it happened suddenly, a moment of crisis survived together, the adrenaline and relief afterward collapsing into something that felt like love, or at least like the only version of love still possible. The ethics of these relationships were complicated. The power dynamics were real. One person owned the space, controlled access to food and safety. The other person was completely dependent. But trauma doesn't follow ethical guidelines. People in impossible circumstances reach for connection however they can find it. Some couples married in hiding. There were no legal ceremonies, no witnesses, no documentation, just two people deciding that if they were going to die, they would die having claimed some small piece of agency over their own lives. A Jewish man and a Polish Catholic woman speaking vows by candlelight in an attic, knowing that the world outside considered their existence together a crime punishable by death. When the war ended, when Soviet troops pushed the Nazis west, when the camps were liberated, when the hiding places could finally open, these couples emerged into daylight as husband and wife. They had survived. Impossibly, against every rational prediction, they had lived. The arithmetic of rescue. The numbers are difficult to calculate precisely. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 100,000 Polish Jews survived the Holocaust by hiding in non-Jewish homes. thousands of Polish rescuers were executed for helping them. After the war, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Center, created the title Righteous Among the Nations to honor non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews. More Poles have received this recognition than any other nationality. Among those rescuers, women were overrepresented. The nature of rescue work, domestic, hidden, requiring long-term care, fell disproportionately to women. Many of these women formed relationships with the men they saved. When the war ended, they married officially. They became families. And when the State of Israel was established in 1948, many of these couples decided to immigrate. The Jewish husbands wanted to live in a place where Jewish identity wouldn't mean death. The wives wanted to be with their husbands. They wanted safety. They wanted to belong. They thought Israel would welcome them. They were wrong. Arriving at the wrong time. In May 1948, Israel declared independence. The next day, 5 Arab armies invaded. The War of Independence lasted over a year. When it ended, Israel had survived, but at enormous cost. 6,000 Jews dead, 1% of the entire Jewish population of the new state. The country was traumatized, militarized, and deeply uncertain about its future. The Holocaust was barely 3 years in the past. Many survivors had just arrived, still processing unfathomable loss. Into this context came waves of immigration. Jews from across Europe and the Middle East, all fleeing persecution, all needing housing, work, and integration into a society that was itself barely functioning. And among them, Polish Jewish men with their non-Jewish Polish wives. The wives had risked everything to save these men. Now they arrived in Israel expecting to be part of the story of Jewish survival. Instead, they became a problem to be managed. The law of return's uncomfortable edge. Israel's law of return, passed in 1950, granted automatic citizenship to any Jew who wanted to immigrate. It was a response to the Holocaust, a guarantee that Jews would always have a safe haven. But what about the non-Jewish wives? Technically, they could enter as family members, they could receive residency permits, but they were not Jews, and in a state explicitly founded as a Jewish homeland, that distinction mattered immensely. Some women converted to Judaism before arriving. Others converted after arrival, navigating orthodox rabbinic courts that often made the process difficult and humiliating. But many didn't convert. Some were Catholic and unwilling to abandon their faith. Others simply didn't see why they should have to. They had saved Jewish lives, married Jewish men, and arrived as part of Jewish families. Wasn't that enough? The Israeli state and society disagreed. The rhetoric of suspicion. In the early 1950s, Hebrew-language newspapers began running articles about the problem of mixed marriages among Holocaust survivors. The tone ranged from concerned to openly hostile. Are these women true converts or opportunists seeking entry to Israel? What will happen to Jewish identity if non-Jewish women raise the next generation? How can we maintain the Jewish character of the state if we allow demographic dilution? Some articles were even more explicit. Women who married Jewish men during the war were described as shiksa hunters, Gentile women who had supposedly seduced vulnerable Jewish men during their moment of weakness. The logic was cruel and absurd. These women had risked death to hide Jewish men. Now they were being accused of exploiting those same men. One newspaper article from 1951 described Polish Catholic wives as Trojan horses, outsiders infiltrating the Jewish state under the cover of marriage. Another used the phrase Russian prostitutes, a slur that collapsed national, religious, and sexual anxiety into a single insult. It didn't matter that most of these women were Polish, not Russian. It didn't matter that they were married. The slur served a purpose. It marked them as outsiders, as threats,
as women who didn't belong. Social humiliation. Mira was 26 when she arrived in Israel in 1950 with her husband, a survivor of Treblinka. She had hidden him for 18 months in her family's farmhouse outside Warsaw. When German soldiers came searching, she told them he was her cousin, home on medical leave. She was 17 years old and terrified, but she held her ground. After the war, they married. He wanted to go to Israel. She went with him. Within a month of arriving, she understood she was unwelcome. Other women at the Immigrant Absorption Center called her Goya to her face, a Hebrew term for non-Jew, but spat out like an insult. When she tried to join conversations, women turned their backs. Her husband was treated differently. He was a survivor, a Jew, a member of the community. She was an outsider who happened to share his bed. At the market, when vendors realized she wasn't Jewish, prices went up. In lines for ration cards, clerks processed her applications last, sometimes making her wait hours for no reason except to make a point. You don't belong here. She spoke Polish, not Hebrew. She didn't know Jewish prayers or customs. She stood out in every social interaction, and people made sure she knew it. Her husband defended her, but even his patience had limits. He was trying to build a new life, to integrate, to move forward. Every day, his wife's presence reminded everyone that he had married outside the community. The pressure was constant.
Employment and housing discrimination. Finding work was nearly impossible for non-Jewish wives. Israel in the 1950s operated on a highly organized communal system. Jobs were distributed through labor unions, kibbutzim, and government programs, all of which prioritized Jewish identity. If you weren't Jewish, you couldn't join certain unions. If you couldn't join the union, you couldn't get certain jobs. If you didn't speak Hebrew, your options narrowed further. Women like Mira ended up in the lowest tier employment: cleaning work, agricultural labor, textile factories. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, and the humiliation was constant, working alongside women who made clear that you weren't really one of them. Housing was similarly difficult. Israel's early housing programs prioritized Jewish families, especially those with children. Mixed marriages were often pushed to the end of waiting lists. Some families ended up in immigrant transit camps, ma'abarot, temporary tent cities meant to house new arrivals until permanent housing could be arranged. These camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and deeply unpleasant. Jewish families moved out within months. Mixed families often stayed for years. The message was clear. The state would house you, feed you, let you stay, but it wouldn't welcome you. Religious exclusion. Judaism is passed through the mother. This is a core principle of Jewish religious law. If a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman and they have children, those children are not considered Jewish under religious law unless the mother converts through an Orthodox process. This created an immediate problem for mixed families. Even if the father was a Holocaust survivor, even if he was fully integrated into Israeli society, his children were not automatically Jewish. They couldn't have a bar or bat mitzvah. They couldn't marry in a Jewish ceremony. They existed in a legal and religious limbo. Many families tried to resolve this through conversion, but Orthodox conversion standards were strict, especially for women perceived as having ulterior motives. Rabbis required months or years of study, strict observance of religious law, and proof of sincere commitment. For women who had already risked their lives to save Jewish men, this felt like an additional punishment. They had proven their commitment with their actions. Why wasn't that enough? Some women refused. They had been raised Catholic. They had faith. Why should they abandon it to prove something to people who had never faced the choices they'd faced? Their refusal created fractures. Husbands pressured wives to convert. Children grew up confused about their own identity.
families fragmented under the weight of rules they hadn't anticipated. The particular cruelty of betrayal. What made this treatment especially devastating was the context. These women hadn't come to Israel seeking opportunity. They hadn't married Jewish men for economic gain or immigration benefits. They had saved lives when the cost of doing so was potential death. They expected gratitude. At minimum, they expected neutrality, a recognition that they were family members, partners, people who had stood on the right side of history. Instead, they were treated as outsiders, as threats, as women who didn't understand their place. The betrayal was structural, but it was also deeply personal. Neighbors who discovered a woman wasn't Jewish stopped speaking to her. Mothers-in-law who initially welcomed their sons' wives turned cold when they realized conversion wasn't forthcoming. Childhood friends of the husbands made cruel jokes about importing goyim. For women who had spent the war years hiding Jewish men, protecting them from Nazis, the irony was unbearable. They had saved Jews from people who wanted to exterminate them. Now they were being pushed to the margins by the very people they'd saved.
Trauma doesn't create wisdom. It would be comforting to believe that suffering makes people better, that communities who endure genocide emerge more empathetic, more inclusive, more aware of the dangers of othering. History suggests otherwise. Trauma often makes communities more defensive, more rigid in their boundaries, more suspicious of outsiders. This isn't universal, but it's common enough to be a pattern. Israel in the 1950s was a nation built by trauma survivors, Holocaust survivors, Jews who had fled Arab countries where they faced persecution, refugees from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, all carrying the weight of displacement, violence, and loss. The national mood wasn't generous, it was defensive. The state had barely survived its first war. Arab armies still surrounded it. The demographic balance felt precarious, and internal cohesion felt like a survival necessity. In that context, the Polish Catholic wives became symbols of a broader anxiety. What happens if the Jewish state stops being meaningfully Jewish? The politics of who belongs. Every nation creates boundaries: citizenship, ethnicity, language, culture. These are the tools societies use to define who belongs and who doesn't. But Israel faced a unique challenge. It defined itself explicitly as a Jewish state, not just a state where Jews lived, but a state that existed for Jews, built on Jewish identity as its organizing principle. This created a conceptual problem. How do you define Jewish in a way that works legally, socially, and religiously? Is it religious practice? Many Israelis were secular. Is it ethnicity? Jews came from dozens of different ethnic backgrounds. Is it shared history? Holocaust survivors and Middle Eastern Jews had vastly different experiences. The solution Israel landed on was a combination of ancestry and religious law. If your mother was Jewish, you were Jewish. If you converted through Orthodox channels, you were Jewish. Otherwise, you were not. This system worked reasonably well for most immigrants, but it created obvious problems for the children of mixed marriages. If a Jewish man married a non-Jewish woman, their children weren't Jewish under religious law. If those children later married Jews, their children wouldn't be Jewish either. Demographers and religious authorities became concerned. Articles appeared in newspapers. Are we losing the next generation? The anxiety wasn't really about individual families. It was about national identity under pressure. Israel's population in 1950 was just over 1 million. The government wanted that number to grow rapidly, both for security reasons and to absorb the waves of Jewish refugees arriving from Europe and the Middle East. But if a significant percentage of families were mixed marriages, the demographic threat became a political issue.
The women became scapegoats for that anxiety. Gender as the boundary line. Nations police boundaries through women's bodies. This pattern appears across cultures and historical periods. When a community feels threatened, one of the first responses is controlling women's sexuality, marriage choices, and reproductive capacity. The logic is partly practical. Children inherit identity through their mothers in many traditions, so controlling who women marry controls who counts as part of the community in the next generation. But the logic is also symbolic. Women become metaphors for the nation itself, pure, protected, belonging to the group. When women marry outside the group, it's treated as betrayal. This dynamic played out intensely in early Israel. The Holocaust had just demonstrated what happened when Jewish communities couldn't protect themselves. Now, in the Jewish state, the imperative was survival through demographic strength and cultural cohesion. Women who married non-Jews were seen as choosing outsiders over the community. They were diluting Jewish identity. They were putting individual desire above collective survival. But the reverse wasn't treated the same way. Jewish men who married non-Jewish women were criticized, but the women bore the heavier stigma. The Polish Catholic wives hadn't chosen Jewish men as an act of rebellion. They had saved them during the Holocaust, but the framing didn't matter. What mattered was that they were non-Jewish women, married to Jewish men, raising children who weren't Jewish under religious law. They became symbols of demographic anxiety, outsider infiltration, and the supposed danger of weakened boundaries. The rhetoric of contamination. The language used to describe these women reveals the underlying psychology. Shiksa, non-Jewish woman, but used as an insult implying seduction and impropriety. Goya, non-Jew, but delivered with contempt. Trojan horses, infiltrators, threats hiding inside the community. Russian prostitutes, a slur that combined anti-Slavic prejudice with accusations of sexual opportunism and economic opportunism. This rhetoric did specific work. It transformed women who had risked death to save Jews into threats to Jewish survival. It resolved the cognitive dissonance of mistreating people who had been heroic. If they weren't really heroes, if they were actually opportunists, outsiders, demographic threats, then their mistreatment became justified. Psychologists call this moral disengagement. When our actions conflict with our values, we change our perception of the people we're hurting rather than changing our behavior. Israeli society in the 1950s couldn't easily acknowledge that it was mistreating women who had saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. That acknowledgement would create unbearable shame. So the narrative shifted. These women weren't rescuers. They were outsiders who had married Jews for personal benefit. They were demographic threats. They were culturally foreign. They didn't really belong. Once that narrative took hold, the mistreatment became easier to justify. The particular case of Polish Catholics. The fact that most of these women were Polish and Catholic added extra layers of hostility. Polish-Jewish relations had been complex and often hostile for centuries before the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism in Poland was widespread. During the Holocaust, while some Poles risked everything to save Jews, others participated in violence against them. After the war, returning Jewish survivors in Poland faced pogroms, most infamously the Kielce pogrom of 1946, where a mob murdered 42 Holocaust survivors. Many Israeli Holocaust survivors were from Poland. They carried memories of Polish anti-Semitism. When they encountered Polish Catholic women in Israel, those memories activated. It didn't matter that these specific women had saved Jewish lives. They were Polish, they were Catholic, they represented a group associated with historical oppression. The women became targets for generalized anger that had nowhere else to go. when victims create new victims. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the story. The people mistreating Polish Catholic wives in Israel weren't monsters. They were trauma survivors trying to build a safe society in a dangerous region. They weren't operating from cruelty. They were operating from fear. Fear that Israel wouldn't survive. Fear that Jewish identity would dissolve. Fear that the demographic balance would shift. Fear that outsiders would weaken the internal cohesion the state needed to survive. Those fears weren't irrational. Israel's security situation was genuinely precarious. The memory of genocide was fresh. The impulse to create clear boundaries around who belonged was psychologically understandable. But understanding the impulse doesn't make the consequences less harmful. The Polish Catholic wives became collateral damage in a process of national identity formation that required clear boundaries and excluded anyone who complicated them. They were morally inconvenient. They disrupted simple narratives. They were evidence that Jews had survived with the help of non-Jews, which complicated the story of Jewish self-reliance that the new state was trying to build. So they were pushed to the margins, labeled, stigmatized, excluded, not because they had done anything wrong, but because their presence complicated the identity politics a traumatized nation needed to survive.
Grażyna's story. Grażyna was 19 when the Nazis invaded Poland. She lived in a small town near Krakow. Her father was a carpenter. Her mother ran a boarding house. They were Catholic, modestly comfortable, unremarkable. When the ghetto was established in Krakow, one of the families forced into it had been their neighbors. The son, Jakub, was 22, a medical student before the war destroyed any future he might have had. Grażyna's family smuggled food into the ghetto, dangerous but manageable as long as they were careful. In 1942, rumors spread that the ghetto would be liquidated. Jakub's family begged Grażyna's parents to hide him. They built a false wall in the attic. Jakub moved in. For 3 years, he lived in a space barely large enough to stand. Grażyna brought him food, emptied his waste bucket, kept him sane with whispered conversations after dark. Somewhere in those 3 years, they fell in love. Maybe it was inevitable. 2 young people in close proximity, both terrified, both desperate for human connection. When the war ended, they married. Jakub wanted to go to Israel. Grażyna went with him. She converted to Judaism, not because anyone pressured her, but because she loved him and wanted their children to be Jewish. They arrived in 1951. The conversion didn't matter. The rescue didn't matter. The years in hiding didn't matter. People heard her Polish accent and switched to Hebrew she couldn't understand. Neighbors made comments loud enough for her to hear. Why did he bring her here? She found work in a textile factory. The other women were polite but distant. During lunch breaks, they spoke in Yiddish, a language Grażyna didn't understand, and laughed at jokes she wasn't part of. Her children grew up ashamed of her, not intentionally, but they absorbed the message from school, from friends, from the broader culture. Having a mother who wasn't born Jewish was something to hide. When her son was 12, he asked her to stop speaking Polish in public. It embarrassed him. She complied. She learned Hebrew slowly, painfully. Her accent never fully disappeared. Every time she spoke, people knew. Jakub tried to protect her, but he was exhausted from his own survival efforts. He worked long hours as a pharmacist. He was building a life. He couldn't fight every instance of discrimination his wife faced. Over time, they stopped talking about it. The discrimination became ambient, part of the background noise of their lives. Grażyna lived in Israel for 40 years. She raised 3 children there. She never returned to Poland. When she died in 1991, her gravestone listed her Hebrew name, the one she'd taken at conversion. Her Polish name appeared nowhere.
Maria's story. Maria didn't convert. She couldn't. She was devoutly Catholic. She had prayed throughout the war for her own survival, for the survival of the Jewish man she was hiding, for an end to the madness. Her faith had sustained her. Asking her to abandon it felt like asking her to erase herself. Her husband, David, understood. He didn't pressure her. He told her it didn't matter. He loved her as she was. But it mattered to everyone else. Their children weren't considered Jewish under religious law. They couldn't have bar mitzvahs. They couldn't marry in Jewish ceremonies without conversion. David's family stopped speaking to him. His mother told him he had betrayed everything she'd survived for. Maria tried to be invisible. She stayed home as much as possible. She avoided social situations. She didn't want to embarrass David. But invisibility had costs too. She was lonely. She had no friends. She couldn't participate in community life. She watched her husband integrate into Israeli society while she remained on the outside. Their marriage frayed under the pressure. David never blamed her explicitly, but resentment built quietly. Every time his family rejected them, every time their children faced discrimination, every time neighbors made comments, the unspoken message was, "This is happening because of you." In 1958, Maria returned to Poland with the children. David stayed in Israel. They never divorced officially, but they never lived together again. Maria raised the children in Poland, in the Catholic faith she'd never abandoned. David sent money occasionally. He visited once. The children grew up confused about who they were, too Jewish for Poland, too Catholic for Israel, belonging fully to neither place. Maria never remarried. She died in 1979 in the same town where she'd hidden David during the war. When journalists interviewed her years later, she said she didn't regret saving him, but she wished he'd stayed in Poland. Israel, she said, had never wanted her. Jadwiga's story. Jadwiga arrived in Israel with her husband Samuel in 1949. Unlike Grażyna and Maria, Jadwiga was extroverted, confident, determined to make it work. She learned Hebrew quickly. She converted within a year. She adopted Israeli customs, changed her name to Yael, wore her hair like Israeli women. She thought assimilation would solve the problem. It didn't. People remembered she wasn't born Jewish. The conversion was seen as utilitarian, not sincere. Women at the market still called her shiksa behind her back. Jadwiga, now Yael, tried harder. She volunteered at her school's children. She joined women's groups. She baked challah for Shabbat and invited neighbors over. Some neighbors came, others declined politely. A few were openly rude. One woman told her directly, "You're not really one of us, no matter what papers you signed." The comment broke something in Yael. She stopped trying to fit in. She stopped volunteering. She withdrew into her family and stopped caring what the community thought. Her children thrived. They were born in Israel, spoke Hebrew natively, were fully integrated. They didn't understand why their mother seemed perpetually unhappy. When they asked, she told them nothing was wrong. But Jacob knew. He watched his wife, this woman who had saved his life, who had crossed borders for him, who had tried so hard to belong, slowly close off pieces of herself to survive the constant rejection. He tried to make it up to her. He loved her fiercely, but love couldn't fix a social structure that marked her as an outsider. Yael lived in Israel for 40 years. She raised 3 children there. She never returned to Poland. When she died in 1991, her gravestone listed her Hebrew name, the one she'd taken at conversion. Her Polish name appeared nowhere.
The children's burden. The children of mixed marriages grew up in a particular kind of limbo. If their mothers had converted, they were technically Jewish, but they still faced suspicion. Other children asked invasive questions. Is your mother really Jewish? Does she keep kosher at home? Does she go to synagogue? Some children lied. They invented backstories for their mothers,
claimed they'd converted before the war, or had always been Jewish, or came from a crypto-Jewish family. Others absorbed shame. They learned to be embarrassed by their mother's accents, their foreign mannerisms, their inability to fully perform Israeli Jewish identity. And some grew angry at the society that rejected their mothers, at their fathers for bringing their mothers to a place that didn't want them, at the impossible position they'd been placed in. Many of these children left Israel as adults. They emigrated to Europe, America, Australia, anywhere they could build identities free from the categories that had constrained their parents. In interviews decades later, some described feeling relief when their mothers died, not because they didn't love them, but because the death released them from the burden of explaining, justifying, defending their mother's presence. That guilt, the guilt of feeling relieved by a parent's death, became another wound to carry. The workplace. For women like Grażyna, Maria, and Yael, employment was a daily site of humiliation. They worked the lowest status jobs: cleaning, factory work, agricultural labor, jobs where their lack of Hebrew fluency or social connections didn't matter as much. But even in those spaces, they faced discrimination. Supervisors gave them the worst shifts. Co-workers excluded them from conversations. If something went wrong, a mistake, a conflict, missing inventory, the foreign woman was blamed first. Some employers explicitly refused to hire non-Jewish women. The justification was usually coded: we need someone who fits with the team culture. We need someone who can work Shabbat. We need someone who understands our community. What they meant: we don't want you. A few women fought back. They filed complaints, demanded fair treatment, refused to be silent. Most didn't. Fighting meant drawing more attention. Attention meant more discrimination. It was easier to keep their heads down and endure. Isolation. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. These women had left behind their families, their friends, their language, their culture. They came to Israel expecting to build new communities with their husbands' families and neighbors. Instead, they found themselves alone. Polish Catholic wives gravitated toward each other when they could find each other. They formed informal support networks. Women who met at markets or factories recognized each other's accents and created small communities of the excluded. They spoke Polish together. They complained in ways they couldn't complain to their husbands. They shared strategies for navigating Israeli bureaucracy, Hebrew language, religious customs. These friendships were lifelines, but they were also reinforcements of outsider status. The very act of gathering as Polish Catholic wives marked them as separate, as not Israeli, as not belonging. Some women tried to avoid these friendships. They feared that associating with other outsiders would further mark them as foreign. They wanted to integrate, to be seen as individuals, not as members of a suspect category. But integration rarely worked. The barriers were too high, the suspicions too entrenched. Most women ended up isolated, excluded from Israeli society, but also separated from each other by geography, circumstances, and the shame of acknowledged outsider status. Aging into invisibility. As these women grew older, the discrimination took new forms. Younger generations of Israelis didn't know their stories. They didn't know these elderly immigrant women with thick accents had rescued Jews during the Holocaust. They just saw elderly immigrant women who didn't quite fit. In nursing homes and hospitals, staff sometimes treated them poorly, not out of malice, but out of casual dismissal. Old immigrant women were low status. They commanded little respect. Some women tried to tell their stories. They wanted recognition for what they'd done during the war. But the stories often fell flat. The Israeli narrative of the Holocaust focused on Jewish resistance, on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, on Israeli independence as the response to genocide. So the women's stories were acknowledged politely, filed away, and forgotten. They had saved lives. They had risked everything. They had crossed borders and cultures and religions to stay with the men they loved, and in the end, they aged into invisibility in a country that had never truly wanted them.
The psychology of trauma and belonging. To understand why Israel treated these women the way it did requires understanding what trauma does to communities. Trauma creates a siege mentality. The world becomes divided into safe and unsafe, insider and outsider, us and them. This isn't irrational. For Holocaust survivors, the division between who would help and who would betray had been literal life and death. Most Europeans had stood by while Jews were murdered. Some had actively participated. A tiny minority had helped. Survivors learned, trust only your own people. Outsiders cannot be relied upon. This lesson was reinforced by Israel's security situation. Arab armies invaded in 1948. Border skirmishes continued throughout the 1950s. The Suez Crisis in 1956 reminded Israelis that they were surrounded by hostile nations. The message was clear: we are alone, we can only rely on ourselves. In that context, clear boundaries around who belonged became psychologically necessary. The boundaries weren't just about citizenship or religion, they were about survival. Letting outsiders in felt like vulnerability, and Israel, in its first decade, could not afford to feel vulnerable. The function of scapegoating. Scapegoating serves specific psychological and social functions. It allows a group to externalize anxiety. Instead of confronting internal problems, economic hardship, political divisions, unprocessed trauma, the group identifies an external threat. The Polish Catholic wives became that external threat. They didn't actually threaten Israel's security. They didn't undermine Jewish identity in any meaningful way. But they were visible, vulnerable, and symbolically useful. Letting outsiders in felt like vulnerability, and Israel, in its first decade, could not afford to feel vulnerable. Scapegoating also strengthens group cohesion. When a community defines itself against an outsider, internal divisions become less important. Different Jewish communities, European and Middle Eastern, secular and religious, left-wing and right-wing, could all agree that non-Jewish wives were a problem. This agreement created a sense of unity that the fractured society desperately needed. The fact that the scapegoating was unjust didn't diminish its social function. If anything, the injustice made it more effective. The women couldn't defend themselves effectively, which meant they remained useful targets. Religious law as social boundary. Judaism's matrilineal descent rule became a tool for boundary enforcement. The rule itself is ancient. It predates the modern Israeli state by millennia. But in the context of Israel's founding, it took on new significance. If Jewish identity passes through mothers, then Jewish men marrying non-Jewish women becomes a demographic problem. The children aren't Jewish, the grandchildren aren't Jewish. Within a few generations, the family line is no longer part of the community. Religious authorities emphasized this logic repeatedly. Rabbis gave speeches warning that mixed marriages would lead to the disappearance of the Jewish people. The rhetoric was apocalyptic. Israel had been founded as a refuge after genocide. Now, just a few years later, Jewish identity was supposedly under threat again, this time from internal dilution rather than external violence. The fact that the threat was largely imaginary didn't matter. Mixed marriages were a tiny percentage of total marriages. The demographic impact was negligible. but the symbolic impact was enormous. Non-Jewish wives became stand-ins for every anxiety about assimilation, loss of identity, and the fragility of Jewish survival. The gendered double standard. The treatment of non-Jewish wives revealed a deep gendered double standard. Jewish women who married non-Jewish men faced criticism too, but the social consequences were different. If a Jewish woman married a non-Jewish man and he converted, he was often accepted relatively quickly. Men could integrate into Israeli society more easily. They weren't responsible for determining children's religious status under Jewish law. But non-Jewish women marrying Jewish men faced permanent suspicion. Even if they converted, even if they raised their children Jewish, they remained marked as outsiders. The double standard reflected deeper anxieties about women as boundary markers. In patriarchal societies, women's bodies are symbolically linked to the nation, to purity, to boundaries that must be protected. When non-Jewish women married Jewish men, they crossed a boundary that society wanted to keep intact. Their presence was a constant reminder that boundaries could be crossed, that Jewish identity wasn't as fixed as people wanted to believe. So they were punished for that crossing in ways that men were not. Historical parallels. Israel wasn't unique in this pattern. Throughout history, communities under threat have policed boundaries through women's bodies and marriage choices. During the Reconstruction era in the American South, white communities violently enforced prohibitions against interracial relationships. The anxiety wasn't really about individual couples, it was about maintaining racial hierarchy in a society that had just abolished slavery. During colonial rule in India, British authorities discouraged relationships between British men and Indian women, especially if the relationships produced children. Mixed-race children complicated colonial categories and undermined the fiction of absolute racial difference. After World War II, European women who had relationships with occupying soldiers, German women with Allied soldiers, French women with German soldiers, faced public shaming, violence, and social exclusion. The pattern is consistent. When communities feel threatened, they police boundaries through women's bodies and marriage choices. Israel's treatment of Polish Catholic wives fits this historical pattern precisely. The Holocaust had just demonstrated the existential threat to Jewish survival. The new state was surrounded by hostile nations. Internal cohesion felt necessary for survival. In that context, women who complicated boundaries, who were physically inside the community but outside it, became targets. The difference between dehumanization and exclusion. It's important to be precise about what was happening. Israel wasn't dehumanizing these women in the way Nazis dehumanized Jews. There were no camps, no systematic violence, no attempt at extermination. But Israel was excluding them, systematically, deliberately, with full awareness of what it was doing. Exclusion operates differently than dehumanization. Exclusion says, you are human, but you don't belong here. You aren't one of us. Your presence disrupts our community. Exclusion can be enforced through law, through social pressure, through casual cruelty repeated so often it becomes normal. The Polish Catholic wives experienced all three. They could live in Israel, they could work, own property, move freely, but they were never fully part of Israeli society. The boundaries were invisible, but absolute. And because the exclusion was social rather than legal, it was almost impossible to fight. You can challenge a discriminatory law. How do you challenge a society that simply doesn't accept you? Could it have been different? It's worth asking, was this treatment inevitable? Could early Israel have welcomed these women? Could it have recognized their heroism and integrated them fully? The answer is complicated. On one level, yes, Israel could have made different choices. It could have emphasized inclusion over boundary maintenance. It could have celebrated mixed families as evidence of non-Jewish support during the Holocaust.
But those choices would have required resources, emotional, social, political, that traumatized communities often don't have. Israel in the 1950s was barely functioning. Housing shortages, economic crisis, constant security threats, a fractured population trying to build a common identity. In that context, the path of least resistance was strengthening boundaries, not dissolving them. That doesn't excuse the treatment these women received, but it explains it. Trauma makes people defensive. Precarious circumstances make communities rigid. Fear makes groups exclude rather than include. Understanding this doesn't make the injustice less real, but it does reveal why injustice happens even among people who have themselves been victims of terrible injustice. Suffering doesn't automatically create empathy. Sometimes it creates the opposite, a determination to protect one's own group at all costs, even if that means creating new victims in the process.
Integration over decades. Slowly, over decades, the position of non-Jewish wives in Israeli society improved. Not because of any official policy change, not because of public recognition or apology, but because time eroded the most intense boundaries. By the 1970s and 1980s, mixed marriages were more common and less controversial. Secular Israelis cared less about religious purity. Immigration from the Soviet Union brought hundreds of thousands of people with complicated Jewish identities. In that context, Polish Catholic wives from the 1950s no longer seemed like threats. They were just elderly women with accents, part of Israel's diverse immigrant population. Some of these women found belated acceptance. Neighbors who had shunned them decades earlier now greeted them politely. Communities that had excluded them eventually absorbed them through sheer persistence. But the acceptance was partial. It came too late to undo decades of exclusion, and it was never accompanied by acknowledgement of the injustice. No official apology was ever issued, no retrospective recognition of what these women had endured. Israeli society simply moved on, leaving the women to process their experiences privately. The children's reckoning. Many of the children of these mixed marriages grappled with their family histories as adults. They had grown up ashamed of their mother's outsider status. As adults, they began to understand what their mothers had sacrificed. Some sought to document their mother's stories. They recorded oral histories, wrote memoirs, created archives. Others pursued recognition. They pushed Yad Vashem to honor their mothers as righteous among the nations. Many succeeded. The women who had saved Jews during the Holocaust finally received official recognition for their heroism. But recognition came late. Many women had already died. They never knew they would be honored. They lived and died believing Israel had rejected them. The children carried guilt about this. They wished they had defended their mothers more. They wished they had understood earlier what their mothers had endured. That guilt became part of how they understood their own identities, as people who had internalized their society's prejudices and only later recognized the injustice. Modern echoes. The treatment of Polish Catholic wives in the 1950s has parallels in contemporary Israel. Russian immigrants who arrived in the 1990s faced similar suspicions about their Jewish identity. Ethiopian Jews faced discrimination based on race and questions about their religious authenticity. The pattern remains. When newcomers complicate existing categories, Israeli society responds with suspicion and exclusion before eventual grudging acceptance. Mixed marriages remain controversial in some communities. Orthodox Jews strongly discourage them. The chief rabbinate maintains strict conversion standards. But secular Israeli society has largely moved past the anxieties of the 1950s. Intermarriage rates are rising. The boundaries are more porous. Still, the historical wound remains. The treatment of Polish Catholic wives is not taught widely in Israeli schools. It's not part of the national narrative. Most Israelis under 40 don't know the story. This silence has consequences.
It prevents reckoning with how a society built by trauma survivors can itself inflict trauma on vulnerable people. Survivor testimony. In the 1990s and 2000s, some of the surviving Polish Catholic wives gave interviews to oral history projects. Their testimonies are striking for their emotional complexity. Some women remained angry. They spoke bitterly about the discrimination they faced, the ingratitude, the years of exclusion. Others were more forgiving. They understood, they said, that Israel was struggling to survive. They didn't excuse the treatment, but they contextualized it. Many expressed ambivalence. They loved their husbands. They loved their children and grandchildren. They were glad their families survived and thrived. But they also acknowledged they had paid a price. They had lost their Polish identities without ever fully gaining Israeli ones. They existed in between, belonging nowhere completely. One woman, interviewed in 2003, said, "I saved his life. I don't regret that, but I wish we had stayed in Poland. I thought Israel would be grateful. It wasn't." Another said, "I understand why they didn't want me. I was a reminder that Jews needed help. Nobody wants to be reminded of that." A third said, "My husband loved me. My children love me. That's enough. The rest doesn't matter anymore." The interviews reveal women who had spent decades processing impossible contradictions. They had done something heroic. They had been punished for it. They had survived that punishment. And now, near the end of their lives, they were trying to make sense of it all. The question of apology. Should Israel apologize? Some descendants of these women argue yes. They say the state owes recognition to women who saved Jewish lives and were then mistreated by Jewish society. An apology would acknowledge the injustice. It would provide historical recognition. It would teach future generations about the costs of boundary policing and collective trauma. Others argue an apology is unnecessary. The women are mostly dead. The social conditions that created the discrimination no longer exist. Dredging up historical guilt serves no purpose. A third perspective suggests an apology is inadequate. What these women needed was inclusion, recognition, and justice while they were alive. An apology now, decades after most have died, is too little too late. The debate remains unresolved. No official apology has been issued. The story remains marginal in Israeli historical consciousness. But the question lingers: what does a society owe to people it has wronged, especially when those people were heroes? Righteous among the nations. Yad Vashem's Righteous Among the Nations program has honored many of the Polish women who saved Jews during the Holocaust. The recognition is significant. It includes a medal, a certificate, and the honoree's name inscribed on the Wall of Honor in Jerusalem. For some families, this recognition provided closure. Their mothers and grandmothers, who had lived as outsiders in Israel, were finally acknowledged as heroes. But the recognition is also limited. It honors the act of rescue, but doesn't address the subsequent mistreatment. A woman can be honored at Yad Vashem for saving a Jew during the Holocaust and still have spent decades being called a shiksa in Israeli society. The recognition doesn't erase that experience. Some descendants find this frustrating. They want acknowledgement not just of the rescue, but of the injustice that followed. Others are satisfied. Recognition is recognition. The fact that it came late doesn't diminish its value. Silence as a coping mechanism. Most of these women never spoke publicly about their experiences in Israel. They didn't give interviews, they didn't write memoirs, they didn't complain to their children. The silence was protective. Speaking about discrimination means reliving it. It means acknowledging victimhood. It means confronting painful emotions that are easier left buried. The silence was also pragmatic. Complaining risked making things worse. It risked alienating the husbands and families they depended on. It risked marking themselves further as outsiders who refused to adapt. So most women stayed quiet. They endured. They built small lives within the constraints they were given. That silence has made historical recovery difficult. Without testimonies, without documentation, large parts of this story remain unknowable. We know the structural facts, the laws, the social patterns, the demographic anxieties, but the internal experiences, what it felt like day to day, how the women understood their own situations, what hopes and disappointments they carried, much of that is lost. The silence was survival, but it was also erasure. What the grandchildren know. The grandchildren of these mixed marriages often have complicated relationships with this history. Many grew up not knowing their grandmothers weren't born Jewish. The conversion or the outsider status was family secret, something not discussed. When they learned the truth, often only after their grandmothers died, they felt betrayed by the silence. Why hadn't anyone told them? Why was this a secret? But they also understood why. Revealing the secret would have exposed their grandmothers to continued discrimination. Silence was protection. Some grandchildren have tried to reclaim this history. They've researched their grandmothers' stories, documented the rescue efforts, insisted on public recognition. Others prefer to let it rest. Their grandmothers wanted to be seen as Israeli, as Jewish, as belonging. Publicly marking them as outsiders, even sympathetically, feels like a final betrayal. There's no easy resolution. The grandchildren carry a history that's simultaneously heroic and painful, a history their grandmothers saved Jews and were then marginalized by the Jewish state. How do you honor that complexity? How do you tell a story that makes everyone uncomfortable? Most don't try. The story remains private, shared within families but rarely beyond them.
The story of Polish Catholic wives in Israel asks uncomfortable questions about gratitude, identity, and moral memory. We like to believe heroism is rewarded, that people who save lives are honored, that societies built by survivors are especially sensitive to injustice. This story reveals the limits of those beliefs. The Polish Catholic wives were heroes. They risked death to save Jews during the Holocaust. Their courage was extraordinary. Their sacrifices were real. And Israeli society treated them as outsiders anyway. Not because Israelis were uniquely cruel, but because trauma creates defensiveness, because young states need clear boundaries, because communities under threat police those boundaries through the bodies and choices of women. The logic was structural, not personal, but the harm was personal nonetheless. Women who had saved lives spent decades being called outsiders in a land built by the people they'd saved. They raised children who were ashamed of them. They grew old in communities that never fully accepted them. Some endured this with grace, others with bitterness. All carried wounds that never fully healed. What does this story teach? First, that suffering doesn't automatically create empathy. Trauma survivors can inflict trauma on others. Victims of persecution can become persecutors themselves. This isn't universal, but it's common enough to be a pattern. Understanding it requires acknowledging the human capacity for contradiction. We can hold opposing moral positions simultaneously, especially when fear governs our choices. Second, that heroism is often inconvenient. The Polish Catholic wives complicated the story Israel wanted to tell about itself, a story of Jewish self-reliance, of independence won through strength, of never again depending on the uncertain mercy of non-Jews. These women disrupted that narrative. They were evidence that Jews had needed help, that non-Jews had provided it, that survival wasn't purely about Jewish resistance. So they were marginalized, not because their heroism, but partly because of it. Third, that national identity formation always creates casualties. Israel needed clear boundaries to survive as a Jewish state. Those boundaries excluded people who complicated them.
The Polish Catholic wives were such people. They weren't enemies, they weren't threats, but they were inconvenient to the project of defining who belonged. So they were pushed to the margins, gently, gradually, but thoroughly. Fourth, that gender remains a primary site of boundary enforcement. When societies feel threatened, they police women's bodies, women's choices, women's relationships. The Polish Catholic wives became scapegoats for demographic anxiety, assimilation fears, and the precariousness of Jewish identity in a new state. They bore this burden not because of anything they did, but because of what they symbolized, the crossing of boundaries that society wanted to keep intact. Finally, that gratitude is conditional and fragile. It exists abundantly in the immediate aftermath of rescue. It fades when political and social pressures mount. The women were grateful to be saved during the Holocaust. The men were grateful to the women who saved them. But gratitude at the individual level couldn't override structural forces at the societal level. Israel didn't reject these women because it forgot what they'd done. It rejected them because remembering what they'd done was less important than maintaining boundaries, defining identity, and protecting the coherence of the national project. This is not a story with heroes and villains. It's a story of humans navigating impossible circumstances, making choices constrained by trauma and fear, and creating new injustices while trying to survive old ones. The Polish Catholic wives deserved better. They deserved recognition, inclusion, and gratitude. They received marginalization instead, not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways that made them inconvenient to a society trying to define itself through exclusion. Their stories remain mostly untold. They lived and died on the margins of Israeli society. Their heroism was acknowledged in museums, but not in neighborhoods. Their sacrifices were honored posthumously, but not during their lifetimes. This is the cost of being morally inconvenient, of complicating narratives, of existing at the intersection of categories that societies want to keep separate. The women who saved Jews during the Holocaust and then lived as outsiders in the Jewish state remind us that history is crueler and more complex than we want to believe, that heroism doesn't guarantee recognition, that gratitude evaporates under political pressure, that trauma creates defensive boundaries even around people who deserve to be included, and that sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones where nobody is purely good or evil, where everyone is human, flawed, operating under constraints, and creating injustices they may not even fully recognize. Those are the stories that matter. Not because they provide simple lessons, but because they reveal how easily moral certainty collapses under the weight of survival, how quickly gratitude fades when identity feels threatened, and how thoroughly good people can create harm while believing they're doing what's necessary. The Polish Catholic wives lived that contradiction. They paid its price, and their silence, maintained for survival, maintained for family, maintained because speaking the truth was too dangerous, ensured that most of the world never knew what they endured. This is their story, incomplete, painful, morally complex. It deserves to be told, not to condemn anyone, but to understand how trauma, identity, and survival create impossible choices that leave scars on everyone involved, rescuers and rescued, insiders and outsiders, nations and individuals. We remember the Holocaust as a moral absolute, evil versus good, perpetrators versus victims, but the aftermath was messier. Survivors built a state while carrying unbearable trauma. They created boundaries to survive. Those boundaries excluded people who deserved inclusion. The Polish Catholic wives fell through those cracks, heroic and unwanted, honored and humiliated, remembered and forgotten simultaneously. Their absence from historical memory is itself part of the story, a reminder that the victims of historical injustice aren't always the ones we expect, that moral categories blur under pressure, and that the price of survival is sometimes paid by people who did everything right and still ended up on the outside.